WNST. Friends at Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. Make sure you're taking advantage of that application that they have there, the ROFO Rewards, saving you money on gas, fried chicken, maybe it's a Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Luke Jones joins us now. The Steve Bisciotti press conference on Friday afternoon, less than an hour. I don't know that we really tilled new soil beyond the Ozzie Newsome pending retirement, which I probably could have broken that story the day before the press conference, that we're getting toward the end of that. I think people around the organization knew that. It appears as though Eric will take over at the end of the year, I guess. I mean, the NFL calendar year is weird with drafts and when it really ends and when it really begins from a scouting standpoint, Luke.
Yeah, and what's helpful here, I mean, we're not talking about a GM being fired. We're not talking about someone who, at least according to what they're saying and things that we've heard over the years, this was always a case of when, not if. I mean, it's been very clear for several years now that Eric DeCosta was the heir apparent. The Ravens have compensated him as such. And according to what Steve Bisciotti said, I mean, this was something that the wheels for this plan, this succession plan, were put into motion a few years ago. They structured Ozzie Newsome's last contract to run through 2018. And at that point, Steve Bisciotti joked that Ozzie will become the league's highest paid scout. So it sounds as though the plan is for Ozzie to stay on in some capacity. Ted Thompson's doing this in Green Bay right now. Maybe not the same exact role.
Emeritus.
Right. Whatever you want to call it. Senior advisor.
Special
advisor. Some kind of fancy title. But long story short, we've talked about this. You talked throughout the week with our Super Bowl coverage whenever we discussed the Ravens. No one else in the history of this organization has been responsible for picking a football player on draft day or ultimately putting a pen to paper, signing a free agent. So it's here. The light is at the end of the tunnel. Very fair questions to ask how Eric DeCosta will do once he does shift into that role. We've talked about it with some of the issues over the last 4 to 5 years. Eric DeCosta has had more responsibilities in recent years. And that doesn't mean that's correlation doesn't automatically translate to causation, but that is a fair question.
In the end, I think fans want someone to get blamed for Jason Elam and Arthur Brown and Brashad Perriman, besides Arthur Brown, Brashad Perriman, and Jason Elam.
You want accountability. And, again, you're going to have misses. We've talked about this with the draft. I think beyond the Ozzie news, one of the more interesting developments or one of the more interesting takeaways that I had was Steve Bisciotti acknowledging that, yes, they've lost some prominent scouts here in recent years. Joe Douglas comes to mind immediately, but you can go back before then. And they've always kind of had that pipeline, those 2020 guys that just learned and progressed.
Well, if you look under the Ozzie tree, right, there was Phil, and Phil's been gone a decade now. Kokinis left, came back. Ortiz has always been there. Eric's always been there. But the rest of those guys have – Eric didn't move. George didn't – Pat, none of those guys move.
Right.
So if you were a 21-year-old Turk in Joe Douglas, you're now a 40-year-old Joe Douglas who's running the Eagles because there was nowhere to go. And when those guys left, to replace those guys with the next group of very young people that's not always going to work out, right?
Oh, it's just like players. It's just like coaches. You're not going to bat 1,000 on that stuff. And look, I'm not even going to sit here and say, well, all their young scouts that they have right now, their less experienced scouts are the problem. That's not necessarily the case either. But Bisciotti did identify a need, most likely, to say, hey, if we lose a Joe Douglas, if we lose an Andy Waddle, who has worked elsewhere, let's keep in mind he wasn't a lifer. But if you lose some of those more experienced scouts,
they probably want more of a guy like Andy Waddle, a guy that's been somewhere else.
And maybe you need to have.
Somebody else's 25-year-old.
You always want to. You always want to have a pipeline. I mean, it's not as though you want to hire all outsiders.
The first decade was unbelievable because it was all the same people every year that came and did my barn dinner.
But at some point in time, for whatever reason, you're going to have that well run dry, and it doesn't. In most cases, it's cyclical. They might hire
players' wells run dry. You only have Ray Lewis and John Ogden.
Here's a perfect example, and I know Zach Orr is leaning towards the coaching side, but I know this offseason he's doing some scouting. He basically had this year-long internship with the Ravens from the point that he announced, or from training camp when they announced it. He worked with Wink Martindale as an assistant linebackers coach, and I know from the time that the regular season ended, he was shifting into personnel. Now, I think he wants to coach, but 3 guys like him you can hire. You can.
Ozzie did the same thing, by the way.
Sure.
Ozzie did quality control,
and
offense,
that's not
defense, scouting.
And
coaching.
by Bisciotti saying this, that's not to say that you completely go away from that. I think you need some of both. You need some experience, and quite frankly, when you have a period like this organization has had over the last 5 years, which I want to emphasize, and I know I've been critical, I don't think they're the worst organization in the NFL. I don't think that they have catastrophic problems that are beyond repair. But when you are, and I know Steve bristled at the notion of them being stagnant. Well, missing 4 out of 5 years, there's some stagnant quality to that. But the point is, maybe you do need a few outside minds, an outside pair of eyes. This was the same argument I used with Dean Pease. And, okay, Wink Martindale is an internal promotion, but it's a different set of eyes. It's some fresh blood in that specific role. And I think from a scouting standpoint, you can make an argument there. Now, the proof will be, what do we see happen? Do they make – probably not going to see changes or additions now because they're already eyeball deep in the pre-draft process, but the time to watch is typically right after the draft. That's when you'll see teams make those changes. That's when you typically will see someone depart if they get a promotion elsewhere. That's when I think the proof will be in the pudding if we see the Ravens make a bunch of changes at that point from a scouting standpoint. But that was one of the
But you won't see scout. I mean, no one will know about you and me.
No
one in the world knows who Joe Douglas was or even is at this point.
And the thing is, if you look at most of these scouts, they have different responsibilities over the years. Some guy will be in the Midwest, some guy will be in the South, someone will be the national scout. You'll jump around. I mean, Joe Douglas had different roles within this organization. So for us outsiders, even those of us privileged to have some connections and insiders in the team that will that we're privy to some information, it's not an exact science trying to assess blame. So even if they do move on from a couple guys take jobs elsewhere, they bring someone else in, that doesn't mean that's an indictment on that specific individual who maybe takes a job elsewhere. So I just thought that was interesting because we've talked about this for a few years now. One of the more understated parts of this discussion has been that because it is difficult to quantify that. I mean, you can see Brashad Perriman not living up to expectations on the field.
But if you went back and watched his tape and you were a professional scout, Brashad Perriman, if he wasn't taken by the Ravens, he was going to be taken within the next 10 picks by somebody.
Yeah.
And that can be said for all these players. I mean, Brashad talked about over-scouting the top 60 guys. That really is where it is, right?
And I thought that was interesting because he noted, and we've talked about this over and over, the Ravens have still done a really good job with those day 3 picks. So why has that equated to not doing well on days 1 and 2? I mean, it should be the opposite, right? You should.
Well, then you yell at the coaches or you yell at the scheme or you say,
and that's part of it too. I mean, that's part of the equation.
Jimmy Jernigan's playing this week. Hey,
that's part of the equation. I mean,
and Harbaugh has a doghouse, and everybody knows that.
We always, as fans, as many in the media, I mean, it's human nature. I mean, you can take this beyond football. We're always looking for a single entity or a single person to blame, and life is very rarely like that, right? It's often somewhere in the middle between this, that reason, that explanation. It's usually a combination of all of those.
When it's on a
guy, some of those.
If you were to ask Arthur Brown, I'm sure it would be scheme and coaches and injury and this.
And there's probably some merit to that.
And the same thing, Brashad Perriman was running around here the other day. You ask him, he'd probably say, well, the plays, the situation, the X, the Y, the left, the right.
But sometimes, even with that, sometimes it's philosophical. I was talking to someone recently, and Kamale Correa, someone we've talked about a whole lot. I get questions almost
because he's the next guy.
On a weekly basis. Why is he playing inside? His natural position at Boise State was outside. And from what I've heard talking to different people, whether they're with the Ravens or people that are just plugged into scouting and all of that, is many the Ravens, I think their impression of him was that he was a tweener. He was a guy that they actually liked the fact that they thought we can play him outside or inside. And from a philosophical standpoint, that sounds great, right?
He's not great at either one.
You want versatile players, and that's just it. Versatility is great until you realize that, okay, it's kind of like Ryan Flaherty. Yeah, he can play 5 different positions,
I swear to God, I was just going to say
but he's not a starting caliber player at any of them. And that's not to say there isn't some value to that. Do you want that in the second round, though? Well, probably not. And 2 years into this thing, I think the proof is in the results. Now, you could argue maybe you move them outside, and maybe they try that. But that's just one example here, and it really shows this is in fairness to the Ravens, and I'm saying that as someone who has criticized them a lot, this isn't a one-size-fits-all where you just read a manual. I mean, these are human beings. These are people who were in certain systems, had certain coaches in college that they responded to, and sometimes you come to the next level and it just doesn't work. Now, that's going to happen. That's why you never bat 1,000, but when you're seeing some trends continuing with the second round, with the third round, that's where you do start to ask questions. And I thought Bisciotti making the comment almost to the point where he basically said, we might have a few too many cooks giving their opinions on these players, and it might be a case that maybe we need to make it less is more. Less is more.
We are live on Radio Row. We're in Minneapolis at the Mall of America. Super Bowl 52, our extended coverage brought to you by D&L Window Tinting. 27 years of putting the shades on the sun. Maybe the Mall of America roof could use that as well. Also brought to you by our friends at Fremont Mortgage. Don't make a 30-year mistake by choosing the wrong lender. You need Carl Delmont and our friends at Fremont. Go to Fremont.com, learn more, buy, sell, and maybe just some information about what's going on. Luke, for the Bisciotti, the Ozzie Newsome thing, but the fighting a little bit about the media would like, us to fire everybody, to fill up their notebooks. Sort of a ridiculous, I thought, in the middle of it. Sort of a flippant thing for him to say, I believe.
Well, let's keep in mind he said that right after he said that he respects the media, which I thought that was interesting. It's kind of like that whole, I don't mean to offend you, but I'm going to go around and offend you. But I think with that whole thing is every media market is going to have a certain amount of that. But I think, and I would certainly hope I'm included in this group. I hope people would think that I'm balanced and measured and try to be fair. I think that was a little bit of a low blow. Reality is, you've missed the playoffs for the last 5 years. I wrote recently, and it's off the top of my head, I want to say there are only 6 or 7 teams in the NFL now who have a longer playoff drought than the Ravens. So it shows, one, that the league does have a lot of parity. It does have a lot of turnover. Things can change very quickly. But at the same time, you've missed the playoffs 4 out of 5 years. If you're going to be so thin-skinned about some criticism and to even just question the possibility of changes, I think that's kind of a bad look. So I can't say I was like I said, it was great for him to say that he respected the media right before he said that.
I mean, there's a part of me that loves that. If I were his employee,
but understand that they're fair questions.
Fair enough.
I mean, missing 4 out of 5 years in the NFL, that's not something. And again, I know they haven't been 4-12.
They're getting on that Buffalo Bills road now of having that distinction of being one of the teams that hasn't been to the playoffs as much the last 5 years.
Well, and I thought Steve made an interesting comparison, and he talked about the idea that we're living with what the Bengals did to us in the same way that Jacoby Jones did to Denver in 2012. Okay, I understand the point he's trying to make. I'm not saying I completely disagree with it. However, we're not talking about the Ravens being knocked out in the divisional round here. This has happened to them at the end of the regular season. You're not even getting into the tournament. If what happened to them happened in the divisional round, this would be a far different discussion. It
happens to Marvin every other year, and he still got his job 17 years later.
So that's where, when I hear something like that, that sounds a little complacent to me. I'm not going to lie. Doesn't mean that everything's broken. I've said that over and over.
Well, it's a much better faith to say he keeps losing playoff games. It pisses me off.
And that's
that's a good problem to have, losing playoff games, right?
But again, you can keep talking about one play away. Well, you're one play away from sneaking into the playoffs as a wild card. You're not one play away from getting to the AFC Championship like what Denver was against the Ravens. So I understand the comparison he was trying to make, but I'll go back to, and I vividly remember talking to you about this after the Christmas game late in 2016, and what I wrote that night at WNST.net is, the Ravens were close, but is it close in terms of they're moving toward their target, or is it close as in you're either spinning your wheels or you're slowly going in reverse?
You'd rather feel like Jacksonville or Minnesota right now, where you have this young team and your young quarterback. In the case of the Eagles don't win on Sunday night. if you're an Eagles fan, you make a case. Well, we'll get back here in the next 5 years because we have a quarterback, because we have a coach, because we have a system.
Sure.
Coaches on the front end. A lot of the young players are still
Sure.
coming. The signed players are in their late 20s, not 33, 34, 35, 36. The most dominant players aren't those guys either. And you can make that case for the Ravens Super Bowl team 5 years ago. As I look at Bryant McKinney, who was on his last legs, right?
Yeah.
Or you look at Ray Lewis, who was on it, or Ed Reed, or Matt Burke. Any of those players that were Bolden to some degree, although there might be an argument.
That's a different one, but yeah, I hear your point.
But young, it's always fun and sexy to be younger and lose in the first or second round of the playoffs if you've got a young quarterback, if you got your cap under control, if you have emerging players.
Well, and we'd be remiss that we've gone this long without talking about Joe Flacco. One of the major takeaways, in addition to Ozzie, in addition to what we talked about with the scouts a few minutes ago, Steve Bisciotti made it very clear that they're not in a position right now where they're looking for the heir apparent to Joe Flacco. They're not actively looking for that. So I think any notions of the Ravens drafting a quarterback in the first round is, I think that's a little overstated at this point. Now, I'll go back to what I discussed with you as we were in Minneapolis throughout the week. I do think they're in a position where they should be looking for a young backup. They should be looking for a younger, cheaper, better version compared to what they've been using with Ryan Mallett the last couple years. I think that's completely fair. And if you end up finding the heir apparent, you find this year's Jimmy Garoppolo or this year's Dak Prescott in the process, and Joe kind of sort of just...
But that takes scouting it up. That takes scouting for
there's a lot of luck involved with that, too.
But it takes scouting up and caring about 15 quarterbacks the same way you were looking for Joe Flacco. Not, well, is it Keith Wenning or is it some safety or linebacker that maybe we can sign after the draft to a free agent deal?
As I've said to you, and I think Bisciotti really confirmed this line of thinking, that it really is a case of you're looking to upgrade from Ryan Mallett. You're not looking to upgrade Joe Flacco at this point in time. I think Steve made it very clear that their goal is they need to put, and I'm not going to put a whole lot into it because he said this in the past and it hasn't happened, but made it very clear they need to get Joe Flacco help. They need to put more playmakers around him. Again, I'll believe it when I see it. You can talk all you want about drafting offensive playmakers and signing offensive playmakers, but until it happens, I'm going to be skeptical, and I think this fan base at this point should be skeptical about that. But Bisciotti made it very clear that the Ravens are not at a point yet, and I think this made sense all along because even next year, which is the first time from a cap standpoint, you can start talking about the possibility, even though it would still be a sizable portion of dead money, really with Joe Flacco, from an advantageous standpoint with the cap, he's going to be in Baltimore, not just this coming season, but probably the year after that.
We got 32 more starts for Joe.
And then it really becomes more interesting. Now, if he gets hurt this year, if he completely falls off a cliff, whatever, then, you could get out of it next year. But Bisciotti made it very clear that they're not really in exit strategy mode with Joe Flacco, and to me that makes sense. You have a head coach.
As Kirk Cousins walks by us, right?
You're going to have a new general manager next year, even if it's not really a new general manager, new in that position. Steve acknowledged that he wouldn't give a playoff or bust edict to Harbaugh, which I think makes sense, but he acknowledged that John's under a lot of pressure, which is kind of the Captain Obvious statement, but I think fans still wanted to hear that. They could be having a new head coach in the next year or two. A year from now, 2 years from now, that's the time to be talking about a new quarterback if they upgrade the personnel around Joe and they do everything possible to get him enough help. And then he's still last in the NFL among qualified quarterbacks in yards per attempt and not being very productive. Then I think you eliminate some of those other variables and you realize, okay, Joe Flacco at age 33 now, 34 next year, 35 the year after that, maybe it's time to move on. Maybe he has reached the end of the road. And if that happens, then you deal with it then. But it's very clear this football team, at least according to Steve Bisciotti, was talking in the present tense about Joe Flacco still being the guy for the foreseeable future.
All right, I'm done talking about the Ravens offseason until September. We're not going to talk about this anymore, are we?
until we're in Indianapolis in a couple weeks for the Combine.
That's just the first 20 minutes. There's another, about 32 weeks, something like that, left before maybe 30 weeks for training camp.
It's a while.
That's a lot of Orioles baseball to you and me.
That is.
All of it is brought to you by our friends at Howard Bank, as well as Rofo and the Royal Farms app now available. Also, the Maryland Jockey Club, where they are racing at Laurel. You're going to be getting those entries in our morning newspaper. I am Nestor. He is Luke. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports.